Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The radio crackled against Marcus's hip, but he didn't reach for it. 6 hours into the search, his hands had developed their own tremor, not from cold, though the Olympic Peninsula's August fog had soaked through his Forest Service jacket, but from something else. Something that made the hairs on his forearm stand rigid beneath the wet fabric. Ranger Webb, this is base. Status update over. Marcus pressed the transmit button without taking his eyes off the tree line ahead. Still on the Hoh River Trail, moving north-northeast. No visual contact. Checking grid section Echo 7. His voice sounded flat in his own ears. Professional. The kind of tone that kept dispatch from asking questions he couldn't answer. Questions like, why did you volunteer for the night shift when you've been walking since dawn? Why won't you let anyone partner with you? Why do you keep stopping to stare at nothing? Copy that. Weather Service says fog's intensifying. Consider returning to negative. Continuing search. He released the button before they could argue. Benjamin Fisher, 15 years old, 5'6", 130 pounds, wearing a blue windbreaker and carrying a telescope case that probably weighed half what he did. Autistic spectrum, high functioning according to the file, which meant he'd wander toward patterns, running water, symmetrical rock formations, anything that repeated in a way that made sense to him. The camp counselor said he'd been obsessed with finding a clearing to watch the Perseid meteor shower. Said he'd memorized the exact coordinates where light pollution would be minimal. Smart kid. Probably smarter than most of the weekend hikers Marcus had to rescue. But smart didn't matter out here after dark. Smart didn't keep you from stepping off a trail you couldn't see, from hypothermia, from the 100 other ways the Olympic wilderness could kill you without malice or intention. Marcus's flashlight beam caught something, a depression in the moss too regular to be natural. He knelt, touched the edge with his fingertips. Boot print, maybe 6 hours old, small enough to be Benjamin's size. The tread pattern matched the description from the intake report. Merrell hiking shoes, practically new, purchased specifically for this trip. He should radio it in, should mark the GPS coordinates, wait for the tracking team to confirm direction and spacing before moving forward. Instead, Marcus stood and kept walking. The wrongness had started around noon, just after he'd volunteered to extend his shift into the night rotation. Nothing obvious at first, just a thickness to the air that his lungs didn't want to process properly, a weight pressing against his sternum that had nothing to do with his pack. His ex-wife Sarah used to call it his spidey sense in the early years, back when she still found his intuitions charming instead of exhausting. You always know when something's off, Marcus. Too bad you can't feel when our marriage needs attention. The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago. He'd spent those months taking extra shifts, volunteering for the searches no one else wanted. Anything to avoid the apartment in Forks that still smelled like her perfume in the bathroom. Like the future they'd planned in every empty room. He pushed through a stand of Sitka spruce, their trunks wider than his arm span. Bark slick with moisture that never fully dried in this part of the forest. The Hoh rainforest received almost 200 inches of rain annually, more precipitation than anywhere else in the continental United States. Everything here existed in a state of permanent dampness, rotting and growing simultaneously, death feeding life in an endless cycle that tourists found magical and Marcus found honest. The boot prints continued, erratic but purposeful. Benjamin was moving with intention, not wandering aimlessly, following something, or running from it. Marcus stopped walking. The forest had gone quiet, not silent. Olympic National Park was never truly silent, always filled with the drip of condensation, the rustle of Roosevelt elk in the underbrush, the distant conversation of ravens. But this was different. This was the absence of those sounds replaced by something that wasn't quite sound at all. More like a pressure against his eardrums, rhythmic and low. Thump, thump, thump. Like a heartbeat, like a drum. He'd heard stories from the older rangers, the ones who'd worked this territory for decades. Stories about the Kino people's sacred sites scattered throughout the park, places where white surveyors had measured and mapped and built trails without permission or understanding, places where the forest itself seemed to resist human presence, where compasses spun uselessly and GPS coordinates drifted by impossible margins. Marcus didn't believe in curses, didn't believe in spirits or warnings from the dead, but he believed in the feeling crawling up his spine right now. The certainty that he was being watched by something that had been here long before the Forest Service, before the park designation, before the first European explorers had stumbled through these woods and declared them discovered. His radio crackled. Marcus? Static. Not dispatch. This was Jim Kowalski, the other ranger who'd been searching the southern quadrants. Marcus, you there? Go ahead, Jim. Found something weird. Trail marker on the spruce nature loop. Someone painted over it. Traditional designs looks like. Circles and triangles, real precise work. Recent too. Paint's still tacky. Marcus's jaw tightened. Vandalism? Maybe, or... Jim's voice dropped. Look, I know you've heard the stories about the old boundaries, the places we're not supposed to. Jim. Marcus kept his voice level. This is a missing child. I don't care about stories. Yeah, you're right, just be careful, okay? Something feels off today. You have no idea, Marcus thought, but he just clicked the radio twice in acknowledgement and kept moving. The boot prints led him off the established trail, into what the maps labeled as unmaintained wilderness. The moss grew thicker here, covering everything in emerald velvet that looked soft but hid treacherous roots and hollows. The Sitka spruce gave way to western hemlock, their branches so dense overhead that his flashlight beam seemed to die after only a few feet, swallowed by the fog and foliage. That's when he saw the trees, 7 of them, arranged in a perfect circle, each trunk at least 12 feet in diameter. Douglas firs, ancient beyond measure, their bark scored with patterns that might have been natural, stress fractures and insect damage, but formed shapes too deliberate to be random, spirals and parallel lines, geometric precision that made Marcus think of Benjamin's fascination with patterns. In the center of the circle, the fog moved wrong. It coiled instead of drifted, turning back on itself in slow spirals that defied the breeze Marcus could feel against his face. And within those spirals, shapes that might have been branches, might have been shadows, might have been something else entirely. Marcus's hand moved to his radio, then stopped. What would he say? Found a creepy circle of trees and fog that moves funny? They'd send the psych evaluation team along with the relief ranger. The drumming sound intensified. Thump, thump, thump. Definitely not his heartbeat. This came from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the soles of his boots. Benjamin. His voice came out rougher than intended. Benjamin Fisher, if you can hear me, make a sound. Any sound. Nothing. Just the drums. He stepped toward the circle. The fog parted, not dissipating, parting like a curtain drawn aside by invisible hands. And there, propped against the base of the largest fir, was the telescope case. Dark blue nylon, expensive looking. One corner dented where it had been dropped or thrown. Marcus ran forward, professionalism dissolving into pure instinct. Benjamin! The case was empty, telescope gone, but inside the velvet-lined interior, someone had arranged a pattern with small stones and moss. A spiral matching the carvings on the trees, so precise it looked machine-made. Benjamin's work. Had to be. The kid who memorized coordinates and found comfort in repetition. But why leave the case? Why create this pattern? Marcus spun in a slow circle, flashlight cutting through the fog. Benjamin, I'm here to help. Your parents are worried sick. The whole camp is looking for you. You're not in trouble, I just need to know your... Movement. 30 yards to his left, between 2 of the ancient firs. A figure. Small. Wearing something dark. Benjamin? The figure didn't respond. Didn't move. Just stood there, perfectly still in a way that living things never stood. with a stillness that seemed to spread outward like cold water, freezing the air molecule by molecule. Marcus's training said to approach slowly, hands visible, voice calm and reassuring. His intuition, that screaming sixth sense that had kept him alive through a decade of wilderness emergencies, said to run. He approached slowly. The fog thickened with each step, moisture condensing on his eyelashes until he had to blink constantly to see. The drumming grew louder, no longer a distant echo but a physical presence hammering against his chest. And the figure remained motionless, features obscured by shadow and mist. 20 yards, 15, 10. If this story is holding your attention, follow for more quality content. What would you do in Marcus's situation? Trust your instincts or follow protocol? Share your thoughts. At 5 yards, Marcus's flashlight beam finally cut through the fog enough to see clearly. Not Benjamin. The figure was carved from wood, cedar probably, weathered by centuries of rain until the features had softened to abstraction, but the basic form remained. A human shape, arms raised to the sky, mouth open in what might have been song or scream. At its base, offerings, rotted cloth, rusted tools, a child's toy from another era, a guardian, a marker, a warning. Jesus, Marcus breathed out, relief and confusion mixing with something darker. If this was here, then Benjamin had definitely come this way, had probably seen the same statue, maybe even left an offering of his own. The kid was thoughtful like that, according to his file, always trying to do the right thing even when he didn't fully understand the social rules. But where was he now? The radio crackled. "Cuss, Marcus, respond. Emergent." Static swallowed the rest. Marcus grabbed the radio, pressed transmit. "Say again, base. You're breaking up." Nothing but white noise. He checked his GPS. The screen flickered, numbers scrolling too fast to read, then died completely. His compass spun lazy circles, needle pointing everywhere and nowhere. The fog closed in. Not gradually, instantly, like a door slamming shut. One moment Marcus could see the wooden guardian and the circle of trees. The next he was surrounded by white so thick he couldn't see his own boots. His flashlight beam reflected back into his eyes. Useless. The drumming stopped. In the silence that followed, Marcus heard breathing. Not his own. Heavier. Rhythmic. Coming from behind him. He spun, flashlight raised like a weapon. Nothing. Just fog. The breathing continued, circling him now. Left. Right. Behind again. Close enough that he should be able to reach out and touch whatever was making the sound. But there was nothing there. Nothing but cold air and moisture, and the certainty that he was not alone. "I'm not here to desecrate anything." Marcus spoke to the fog, to the breathing, to whatever presence filled this circle of ancient trees. "I'm looking for a lost child, 15 years old, scared. He doesn't understand what he stumbled into. Please, if there's any part of this that's real, if you're actually here and not just my mind breaking from exhaustion, let me find him." The fog shifted. A gap opened, narrow and precise, cutting through the white like a hallway. At the far end, perhaps 50 yards away, a blue windbreaker hung from a branch. Benjamin's jacket. Marcus ran. The fog closed behind him as he moved, creating a tunnel that forced him forward, no option to retreat or deviate. Tree roots grabbed at his boots. Branches that shouldn't exist at this height lashed his face. The drumming returned, faster now, urgent, driving him onward toward the jacket and whatever lay beyond it. He burst into a clearing. The fog ended abruptly at its edge, as if an invisible wall held it back. Above, the sky had cleared enough to reveal stars, thousands of them, more than should be visible with the ambient light from Port Angeles and Forks. The Milky Way stretched across the darkness like a river, and in its center the Perseid meteors streaked past in steady succession. Perfect viewing conditions. Exactly what Benjamin had been searching for. The boy sat on a flat stone in the clearing's center, telescope mounted on its tripod, eye pressed to the eyepiece. He wore a t-shirt despite the cold, arms bare, but he didn't shiver. Didn't move at all except for small adjustments to the telescope's position, tracking something across the sky with mechanical precision. Benjamin. Marcus approached slowly, hands visible. "Benjamin Fisher?" The boy didn't respond. Marcus got closer, close enough to see Benjamin's face in profile. His expression was blank, serene, eyes open but focused on something far beyond the stars he was supposedly watching. Drool had dried on his chin. His lips moved soundlessly, counting or reciting or praying, impossible to tell which. "Benjamin, I'm Marcus Webb. I'm a park ranger. Your camp counselor sent me to find you." Nothing. The boy's hands moved to adjust the telescope's angle, fingers working with practiced efficiency, but his eyes never blinked, never wavered from their distant focus. Marcus reached out, touched Benjamin's shoulder gently. The boy's skin was cold. Not hypothermic cold, something else, something that made Marcus think of marble statues and preserved specimens, temperature that came from absence rather than loss. "Benjamin, I need you to listen to me. We need to leave. Right now." The drumming returned, so loud now that it vibrated Marcus's teeth. He looked around the clearing, searching for the source, and finally understood what he was seeing. The flat stone Benjamin sat on wasn't a stone. It was carved, its surface covered in the same spiral patterns that marked the wooden guardian, the trees, the arrangement Benjamin had created in his telescope case. And around the clearing's perimeter, more guardians stood watch. Not wooden carvings, but stones, dozens of them, each one marking a specific point in the circle. This was a sacred site, not just sacred, active, alive, pulsing with something that predated Marcus's understanding of possible and impossible. And Benjamin sat at its center, plugged into something that was slowly hollowing him out, using him as a vessel or a battery or a bridge between worlds Marcus didn't believe in. Didn't believe in. Past tense. "Okay." Marcus spoke to the clearing, to the guardians, to whatever watched from beyond the fog. "I understand. This is your place. He's trespassing. I'm trespassing. But he's a child. He didn't know I'm asking." His voice cracked. "I'm begging. Let me take him home." The drumming stopped. The silence was absolute, deeper than before, as if every sound in the forest had been erased from existence. Marcus's ears rang with the absence. Then, movement in the fog at the clearing's edge. A figure emerged, taller than the wooden guardian, more solid than shadow, less than flesh. It walked with a gait that suggested great age, each step deliberate and measured. In its hands, if those were hands, it carried something that might have been a staff or a spear or a branch that had learned to stand upright. Marcus's rational mind tried to catalog what he was seeing. Ceremonial costume, lost hiker in traditional dress, hallucination from exhaustion and stress. But his intuition, that part of him that had always known when something was wrong, that had felt the wrongness building all day, that part recognized what stood before him. The guardian, the watcher, the protector of this place, not a ghost, not a spirit. Something that predated those concepts that existed in the space between story and reality, sustained by belief and time and the forest's own memory. It raised one hand, definitely a hand now, gnarled and ancient, fingers too long and joints bending in impossible directions. Pointed at Benjamin, then at Marcus, then back toward the fog. The meaning was clear. Take him. Leave. Do not return. Marcus didn't wait for a second invitation. He scooped Benjamin into his arms, lighter than expected, hollow somehow, and ran for the fog wall. The boy didn't react, didn't struggle, just kept his eyes fixed on the sky, lips still moving in their silent count. The fog opened before Marcus like it had before, creating that same narrow corridor, but this time it felt less like guidance and more like expulsion. He crashed through underbrush, Benjamin's telescope abandoned on the carved stone, all his carefully packed equipment left behind as Marcus ran with single-minded focus toward anything that resembled the established trail. His radio burst to life. "Cuss! Marcus, respond, we've got... Base, this is Webb. I've got him. I've got Benjamin Fisher. He's alive, unresponsive but breathing. I'm bringing him out now. Send medical to the Ho River trailhead. Copy that. Marcus, where the hell have you been? We lost your signal for 40 minutes. 40 minutes. It had felt like hours. Marcus kept running, Benjamin's cold body pressed against his chest, until the fog finally thinned and he stumbled back onto the Ho River Trail. Its packed earth and trail markers suddenly the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. His GPS flickered back to life, coordinates locking onto satellites. The forest sounds returned. Dripping water, rustling elk, raven conversation. Normal, real, rational. The medical team met him a mile from the trailhead. They took Benjamin gently, wrapping him in thermal blankets, checking his vitals with practiced efficiency. Hypothermia, they said, early stages. Lucky you found him when you did. Another hour and... They didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Marcus watched them load Benjamin into the ambulance. Watched the boy's parents arrive from the camp in a state of grateful hysteria. Watched everyone do their jobs with the competence that made the Forest Service function. No one asked about the fog, about the drums, about where exactly Marcus had found the boy or why he'd abandoned all the expensive equipment that Benjamin's parents had saved months to buy. Jim Kowalski appeared at Marcus's elbow, holding a thermos of coffee that Marcus accepted without question. Heard you found him in one of the sacred circles. Marcus didn't answer. It's okay, Jim continued quietly. Half the old-timers have stories, things they've seen. They don't talk about it much because who'd believe them? But we all know there are places in this forest that aren't really ours. Places we're tolerated, not welcomed. The medical team said hypothermia. Marcus said flatly, "Yeah, that's what the report will say." Jim took a sip of his own coffee. But between you and me, that kid's eyes, when they loaded him up, he was looking at something none of us could see. Still counting something, still tracking patterns that don't exist in our version of reality. Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to insist on rational explanations, coincidence and natural phenomena, and the simple fact that a frightened child had gotten lost in the woods and shut down mentally from stress. But he'd felt the cold of Benjamin's skin, had heard the drums, had watched the fog part with intention and purpose, had met something in that clearing that was neither alive nor dead, neither malevolent nor benevolent, but simply other, a presence that existed in the Olympic wilderness long before humans decided to call it a park, and would exist long after the last ranger hung up their badge. "I'm putting in for a transfer," Marcus said. "Maybe Olympic National Forest, or Mount Rainier, somewhere else." Jim nodded slowly. "Probably smart. This place gets in your head if you let it, especially for people like you. People like me. People who can feel things, who know when something's wrong before they can explain why." Jim clapped him on the shoulder. "That's not a weakness, Marcus. It's what makes you good at this job. But it also means you see things the rest of us miss, and once you've seen them..." He trailed off, looking toward the ambulance as it pulled away, lights flashing but no siren. "Once you've seen them, you can't unsee them." The ambulance disappeared around a curve in the access road. Marcus stood in the parking lot, still holding the coffee, watching the forest edge where the Ho River Trail vanished into darkness. Somewhere in there, in a clearing he could no longer find even with GPS coordinates and a map, Benjamin's telescope sat on a carved stone. Somewhere in there, the fog moved in spirals that defied meteorology. Somewhere in there, guardians watched and waited and protected boundaries that predated surveyors and treaties. Marcus finished his coffee, filed his report, drove back to his empty apartment in Forks, and showered until the water ran cold, trying to wash away the feeling of being watched, of existing at the sufferance of something vast and patient and utterly indifferent to human concerns. 3 weeks later, he transferred to North Cascades National Park, put in a request for the most remote district they had, the least accessible trails, the areas where hikers rarely ventured. He told himself it was about solitude, about healing, about starting fresh in a place that didn't remind him of failed marriages and impossible encounters. But late at night, when sleep wouldn't come and his sixth sense prickled with sourceless warnings, Marcus knew the truth. He was looking for another clearing, another sacred site, another moment when the boundary between worlds grew thin enough to see through. Because once you've been to the other side, Once you've stood in that liminal space and felt the presence of something truly other, the rational world becomes paper thin, a comfortable lie that everyone agrees to believe. And Marcus had never been good at lying to himself. Benjamin Fisher recovered physically within a week. Doctors found no lasting damage, no explanation for his unresponsive state beyond stress and mild hypothermia. His parents took him home to Oregon, grateful and shaken, planning to find a nice therapist who specialized in trauma. But the camp counselors told a different story, shared in whispered conversations that never made it into official reports. Benjamin had changed, still brilliant, still fascinated by patterns and numbers. But now he drew spirals in the margins of his notebooks. Now he stared at trees too long, as if seeing shapes in their bark that no one else could perceive. Now he spoke sometimes about the things he'd learned during those 40 missing minutes, about the mathematics of boundaries and the geometry of sacred space. His parents thought it was PTSD, harmless fixation, coping mechanism, something therapy would eventually resolve. The counselors knew better. Some boundaries, once crossed, leave marks that never fully fade. Some knowledge, once gained, can't be forgotten or dismissed. The Olympic wilderness keeps its secrets well. But occasionally, when the fog rolls in thick and the old trees creak with ancient weight, it shares those secrets with those who stumble into the wrong clearing at the wrong time. And those people are never quite the same afterward. Thank you for reading to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following for more immersive stories. What's your interpretation of Benjamin's fate? Was he truly touched by something supernatural, or was it all a traumatic stress response? I'd love to read your theories in the comments. The rain had been falling for 6 days straight when Christopher Bennett arrived at the Hoh Rainforest Ranger Station, and according to the weathered map pinned to the bulletin board, it would continue for at least another week. He'd worked search and rescue operations in 12 different national parks over the past 8 years, and he'd learned that the Pacific Northwest had its own rules. Rules that didn't care about your experience, your equipment, or your timeline. Chris stepped out of his truck and immediately felt the weight of the Olympic National Park pressing down on him. The Douglas firs and Sitka spruces towered overhead like cathedral pillars, their canopy so dense that even at noon, the forest floor existed in permanent twilight. Moss draped everything, trees, rocks, fallen logs, creating a landscape that looked more like a living organism than a collection of individual plants. The air itself felt thick, saturated with moisture and the sweet rot smell of decomposition. "You Bennett?" A woman emerged from the ranger station, her North Face jacket beaded with water despite the brief walk from the door. She was in her mid-40s, with sharp eyes that had seen too many bad endings in these woods. "That's me." Chris extended his hand. "You must be Ranger Morrison." "Diane, thanks for coming so quickly." She gestured toward the station. "Let's talk inside. You'll want to see what we found." The ranger station was cramped and overheated, a stark contrast to the damp cold outside. Topographical maps covered every wall, marked with colored pins and hand-drawn notations. A police radio crackled intermittently in the corner. Chris recognized the setup. This was a command center for a search that had already gone wrong. Lauren Hutchins, 26 years old, experienced backpacker. Diane began, spreading a map across the table. She checked in here 6 days ago, planning a solo 3-day hike along the Hoh River Trail with a detour into the backcountry. Should have been back by now. We found her campsite yesterday. Chris pulled out his notebook, falling into the familiar rhythm of assessment and analysis. What's the concerning factor? Weather? Injury? Diane's expression darkened. Neither. Come look at these. She led him to a side table where a series of photographs were laid out. Chris picked up the first one, and his analytical mind immediately began cataloging details. The image showed a campsite in a small clearing, tent still standing but collapsed on one side. Nothing unusual about that. Wind and rain could easily cause structural failure. The second photograph made him pause. The tent's entrance had been torn open, the zipper ripped entirely from the fabric. Not cut, not carefully opened, ripped with enough force that the nylon was shredded in long vertical strips. Around the tent opening, pressed deep into the mud, were prints. "Those aren't bear tracks," Chris said slowly. "No, they're not." Diane handed him a magnifying glass. "Look closer." Chris studied the prints. They were roughly humanoid, 5 distinct digits, something that could be called a heel. But they were wrong. Too large, easily 14 inches long. The toe impressions were irregular, almost claw-like. And the depth of the impressions suggested something impossibly heavy had made them. "Could be a hoax," Chris said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Someone trying to create a Bigfoot situation for attention." "Look at the third photo." The third image showed the inside of the tent. Lauren's sleeping bag had been pulled out and torn apart. Feathers from the down insulation scattered everywhere. Her backpack had been opened, contents strewn across the tent floor. But it was the back wall of the tent that seized Chris's attention. Scratched into the nylon deep gouges that had torn through the waterproof coating was a symbol. It looked like a crude face, circular, with deep hollows for eyes and a gaping mouth. The scratches were fresh, the edges of the torn fabric still sharp. "There's more," Diane said quietly. She handed him a clear evidence bag. Inside was a small digital camera. "This was in her backpack. We found it yesterday, brought it back to review the photos." Chris turned the camera on. The first several images were what he expected. Scenic shots of the rainforest, Lauren smiling in selfies, a black-tailed deer near the trail. Then the images changed. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. on the third night of her trip. The photo was dark, illuminated only by camera flash, and showed the interior of her tent. Lauren had apparently heard something outside and was documenting it. The next photo, taken seconds later, showed a shadow against the tent wall. Tall, hunched, with arms that seemed too long. The following image was blurred, as if the camera had been dropped or thrown. But in the corner of the frame, just barely visible, was something that made Chris's blood run cold. A hand, if it could be called that, pressing against the tent from outside. The fingers were elongated, the palm too wide, and there was something fundamentally wrong about the proportions. "The last photo," Diane prompted. Chris scrolled to the final image. It was almost completely black, but the timestamp indicated it had been taken at 3:23 a.m. As his eyes adjusted to the screen, he could make out a shape in the darkness. 2 points of light, reflections from the flash, perhaps from eyes, positioned about 7 feet off the ground, and below them a mouth that seemed too wide, too dark. "We need to consider the possibility that Lauren staged these," Chris said, though every instinct he'd developed over 8 years in search and rescue was screaming that something was genuinely wrong. People disappear in national parks for publicity stunts. It happens. Does it happen with this? Diane opened a drawer and removed another evidence bag. Inside was a piece of bark, roughly 8 inches square. Carved into it with something sharp were symbols, circles and lines and geometric shapes that looked almost like a primitive language. "Where did you find this?" "Nailed to a tree 50 feet from her campsite. There were 9 more just like it, forming a circle around the area." Chris examined the bark closely. The carvings were fresh, the wood beneath still pale where it had been scored. But something about the symbols triggered a memory. During his orientation for Olympic National Park 3 years ago, there had been a brief cultural sensitivity training about the indigenous peoples of the region, the Quileute, Makah, and Quinault tribes. "These look like coastal Salish symbols," he said slowly, "or something approximating them." "That's what we thought. We had a consultant from the Makah Cultural Center come look at them. He got very quiet, then told us we needed to remove them immediately and leave the area." Diane's voice dropped. "He said they were warning markers, old markers, the kind that weren't supposed to be used anymore." "Warning against what?" Diane met his eyes. He wouldn't say. He just kept repeating that we needed to get everyone out of that section of forest. Then he left and won't return our calls. Chris set down the photograph and forced himself to think analytically. "What's your working theory?" "Officially, Lauren encountered someone in the woods. Possibly someone mentally unstable who's familiar with local indigenous mythology. They may have taken her, or she may have fled deeper into the forest. We have teams searching in a 5-mile radius from her campsite. And unofficially? Diane was quiet for a moment. I've worked in this park for 22 years, Chris. I've seen hikers die from exposure, fall off cliffs, get mauled by animals. This is different. There's something about that site that feels wrong. My team members won't stay there after dark. Even the ravens avoid that area now. Chris recognized the conflict in her voice. The rational mind struggling against primal instinct. He'd felt it himself occasionally. That sense of wrongness that couldn't be explained by data or experience. But he'd always pushed it aside, found the logical explanation. I'll need to see the site myself, he said. Can you take me there this afternoon? Are you sure? It's a 4-hour hike in, and with this rain, we won't make it back before dark. I've worked in worse conditions. Chris began packing his gear. If Lauren's still alive, every hour matters. What he didn't mention was the other reason, the one that made his analytical mind uncomfortable. Those photographs had triggered something in him, a deep unease that he couldn't explain away. And Christopher Bennett had built his entire career on being able to explain everything. The hike to Lauren's campsite was brutal. The trail followed the Hoh River, which had swollen with 6 days of continuous rain. Its normally clear water now a churning brown torrent. The forest pressed in from both sides, massive trees disappearing into the mist overhead. Every surface was slick with water and moss, making each step treacherous. Diane moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew these trails intimately. Chris followed, his mind cataloging details. Tree markers every quarter mile, distance from the river, elevation changes. All the data points that would matter if they needed to evacuate someone or recover a body. We're about a mile from the campsite, Diane said, checking her GPS. The device's screen flickered in the rain. This is where the marked trail ends. Lauren went off trail here, probably looking for a more secluded camping spot. They pushed through dense undergrowth, following flagging tape that the search teams had left. The forest seemed to close in, the canopy so thick that Chris had to use his headlamp despite it being only 3 in the afternoon. The sound of rain on leaves created a constant white noise that made it impossible to hear anything else. When they reached the campsite, Chris understood why Diane's team didn't want to stay after dark. The clearing was small, maybe 30 feet across, ringed by ancient cedars whose trunks were wider than his truck. The tent was still there, collapsed and waterlogged, exactly as shown in the photographs. But photos couldn't capture the atmosphere of the place. The air felt heavy, oppressive. The rain seemed to fall harder here, as if the clearing existed in its own microclimate, and it was absolutely silent except for the rain. No birds, no insects, no sound of small animals moving through the underbrush. Just the relentless patter of water on leaves, and the distant roar of the river. You feel it? Diane said quietly. It wasn't a question. Chris wanted to deny it, to explain it away as psychological suggestion or the natural isolation of the backcountry. But he couldn't. Every instinct was telling him to leave, to get out of this clearing and never come back. Instead, he pulled out his flashlight and approached the tent. The interior was exactly as photographed, sleeping bag torn apart, gear scattered, that symbol scratched into the back wall. Chris forced himself to examine everything methodically. He checked for blood, none. Hair samples, several. Bagged for analysis. Any sign of struggle beyond the obvious damage. The warning symbols, he called to Diane. Show me. They were easy to find once he knew to look for them. Pieces of bark, each carved with those strange circular symbols nailed to trees at irregular intervals around the campsite. Chris approached the nearest one, shining his light on the carvings. The symbols were more complex than he'd thought. Concentric circles with lines radiating outward. Geometric patterns that almost looked like faces. Crude representations of eyes and mouths. And below them, smaller markings that might have been words or might have been decorative elements. He reached out to touch one and Diane's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. Don't. Why not? The Maca consultant, before he left, he said that touching the markers would make things worse, that they were boundary warnings and crossing them was... She struggled for the word. Forbidden. Chris pulled his hand back, annoyed at his own hesitation. He didn't believe in forbidden boundaries or supernatural warnings, but something about those symbols made his skin crawl. Behind them, a branch cracked. They spun around, flashlights cutting through the rain and mist. Nothing. Just trees and undergrowth and the endless cascade of water. Probably just a branch falling, Chris said, but his voice sounded uncertain even to himself. Another crack, this time to their left. Closer. We should head back, Diane said. It's getting dark. Chris checked his watch. 4:47 p.m. They had maybe 30 minutes of marginal daylight left, and the hike back would take at least 3 hours in these conditions. They'd be in the forest after dark. 5 more minutes, he said. I want to check for any trail markers Lauren might have left. He moved to the edge of the clearing, scanning the forest floor for any sign of passage. That's when he saw it. A piece of bright orange fabric, the kind used for trail markers, tied around a low branch about 20 yards into the forest. Diane, over here. She joined him and they both stared at the marker. Beyond it, barely visible in the gloom, was another orange marker. And beyond that, another. She marked a trail, Chris said. She went deeper into the forest. Or someone wants us to think she did. Chris looked at her. You think this is a trap? I think we need to leave. Now. We can come back tomorrow with a full team. But Chris was already following the trail markers, his analytical mind overriding his instincts. If Lauren had gone this way, there might be clues about what happened to her. Evidence, data, something to explain the inexplicable. The markers led them on a winding path through increasingly dense forest. The trees here were massive, their trunks 20 feet across, their branches creating a canopy so thick that Chris's headlamp was almost useless. The undergrowth thinned out in the deep shade, making walking easier but also more unsettling. There was nowhere to hide, and nowhere to run. After about 10 minutes, the markers led them to another clearing. This one was larger, roughly circular, and in its center stood something that made Chris stop short. It was a structure, not natural, definitely not natural, made from branches and bark lashed together with what looked like strips of cedar bark. It stood about 8 feet tall, roughly human-shaped, with a round head and long arms extending outward. The head was carved with that same symbol they'd seen on the tent and the warning markers, a circular face with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth. What the hell is that? Chris whispered. Diane's flashlight beam was shaking. I've never seen anything like it. It's not native construction. It's not anything official. Chris approached the structure slowly, his scientific mind trying to catalog and explain. It was clearly recent. The bark and branches were still green, the construction marks fresh. Someone had built this probably within the last few weeks. But why? And for what purpose? Around the base of the structure, arranged in a careful circle, were objects. Chris knelt to examine them, and his stomach clenched. A backpack, women's hiking boots, a water bottle with a familiar logo. These are Lauren's, Diane said, her voice tight. But there was more. Other items, a man's wallet, water damaged but still identifiable. A digital camera, older than Lauren's, a child's plastic toy, a wedding ring. All arranged with careful precision, all weathered by time and exposure. How many people have gone missing in this area? Chris asked. Officially, 3 in the last 5 years, including Lauren, but... Diane paused. There are stories. Hikers who were never found. People who walked into this forest decades ago and never walked out. The tribes don't come here. They call this place Tithothak Swell, where she hunts. Where who hunts? Before Diane could answer, a sound echoed through the forest. It started low, almost subsonic, a rumbling that Chris felt in his chest more than heard. Then it rose in pitch, becoming a shriek, not quite human, not quite animal, that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Run, Diane said. "Chris, we need to run, now!" They ran. The forest became a nightmare of tangled roots and low branches. Chris's headlamp bounced wildly, creating disorienting shadows. Behind them, the shrieking continued, joined now by the sound of something massive moving through the undergrowth, branches snapping, foliage being crushed under enormous weight. Chris's mind tried desperately to rationalize. A bear. It had to be a bear. Or an elk. Something large and territorial that they'd startled. Not. A tree exploded behind them, bark flying, as something struck it with impossible force. They burst into a small ravine, sliding down a muddy slope. Diane fell and Chris hauled her up, both of them gasping. The sounds of pursuit had stopped, but Chris knew it didn't mean they were safe. "The markers," Diane panted. "We crossed the markers. We weren't supposed to cross them." "That's not..." Chris started, then stopped. Because his rational mind was failing him now, there was no animal that could make that sound. No animal that could hit a tree hard enough to splinter it. No animal that would arrange personal effects in a ritual circle. "Sonoqua," Diane whispered. "The basket woman. That's what Thothixwo means, where basket woman hunts." "That's mythology. Folklore." "Is it?" Diane's eyes were wide in the lamplight. "The Maka consultant told me before he left. Sonoqua was a giantess who lived in the deep forest. She collected people, children especially, but adults too. Put them in her basket and took them to her cave. The tribes used to leave offerings to keep her away from their villages, but no one's left offerings here in 100 years. A branch cracked upslope. They froze. In the beam of Chris's headlamp, just at the edge of visibility, something moved. It was tall, impossibly tall, with a silhouette that was almost human, but fundamentally wrong. The proportions were distorted, the limbs too long, the shoulders too broad, and as it stepped closer, Chris saw the face. Round, hollow-eyed, mouth opened in a permanent, gaping expression, the same face carved into the bark markers, the same face scratched into Lauren's tent. Chris's rational mind shattered. This couldn't be real, couldn't exist. But it was there, solid and present, water streaming off its dark skin, eyes reflecting their flashlight beams like an animal's. It shrieked again, and the sound was so loud, so physically painful, that Chris dropped to his knees. Beside him, Diane was screaming, scrambling backward. The creature took another step forward, and Chris saw what it was carrying. A basket, woven from cedar bark and decorated with more of those carved symbols. And inside the basket, barely visible, was a pale human hand. "Lauren," Chris breathed. The creature's head tilted as if considering him. Then it spoke, and that was the worst part, because it could speak, in a voice like grinding stone and rushing water. The boundary was marked. The warning was given. It took another step toward them, and Chris's paralysis broke. He grabbed Diane and hauled her up the opposite slope, his lungs burning, every survival instinct overriding his rational mind. Behind them, the creature shrieked again, and the sound was joined by others, multiple voices echoing through the forest. They ran for hours, or maybe minutes. Time had lost meaning. Chris only knew that they were moving, crashing through the forest, following the sound of the river that would lead them back to the trail. His mind was fragmenting, unable to process what he'd seen, defaulting to pure survival mode. When they finally emerged onto the marked trail, both of them collapsed, gasping. The rain had intensified into a downpour, and somewhere in the chaos, Chris had lost his backpack. His hands were bleeding from where he'd grabbed branches to pull himself up slopes. Diane's jacket was torn, her face scratched, but they were alive. "Did you..." Chris started, then stopped. Because he didn't want to hear the answer. Didn't want confirmation that what he'd seen was real. "Yes," Diane said quietly. "I saw it." They made it back to the ranger station just after midnight. Chris's truck was still there, covered in fallen needles and moss. Everything looked normal, mundane, real. But Chris knew he would never see the world the same way again. Inside the station, Diane immediately got on the radio. "This is Ranger Morrison. I need search and rescue teams pulled from the Ho River backcountry immediately. All teams. Pull them out now. Diane, what happened? The voice on the other end sounded concerned. Did you find Hutchins? Diane looked at Chris and he saw in her eyes the same struggle he was feeling. The desperate need to make sense of the senseless. To fit what they'd experienced into a framework that rational minds could accept. No, she said finally. We didn't find her. But the area is too dangerous for further search. I'm calling it. You're calling off the search? After one day? Yes. Mark that section as high risk. No one goes in there. That's an order. She ended the transmission and slumped in her chair. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of rain on the roof filled the silence. What was in the basket? Chris asked finally, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. I don't know. I don't want to know. Diane pulled out a flask and took a long drink, then offered it to Chris. He accepted gratefully. We have to tell someone, he said. We have to tell them what? That we saw a giant creature from indigenous mythology carrying a basket of body parts? They'll pull us from duty for psychological evaluation. But Lauren is gone. Whatever that thing is, wherever it took her, she's beyond our help now. Chris knew she was right, but the analytical part of his brain was still trying to function, still trying to make sense of data. The offerings. You said the tribes used to leave offerings. What if... No. Diane's voice was firm. We're not going back there. We're not trying to negotiate with that thing. We're not doing anything except marking that area off limits and hoping it stays in its territory. What about the next hiker who wanders off the trail? The next person who crosses those boundaries? Then they'll disappear just like all the others. Just like Lauren. Diane met his eyes. You asked me earlier how many people have gone missing in this area. Officially, 3 in 5 years. But I've been going through old records. Since this park was established in 1938, there have been 47 unexplained disappearances in the Ho Rainforest region. 47 people who walked into the forest and vanished. No bodies, no evidence, nothing except... She pulled out a file box from under her desk and opened it. Inside were dozens of incident reports, yellowed with age. And clipped to each one was a photograph of carved bark. Warning markers. Every single disappearance going back decades had occurred near warning markers. Chris felt his worldview collapsing completely. Everything he'd believed about the natural world, about rational explanation, about the supremacy of human understanding, all of it was crumbling, because the evidence was irrefutable. Something lived in that forest, something old and terrible that had been there long before rangers or hikers or anyone with GPS and rescue equipment. The tribes knew, he said quietly. They've always known. Yes, and they marked the boundaries and stayed away. But we didn't listen. We created a national park and put trails through territory that was never meant for humans. And now, people die. Diane closed the file box. 47 that we know of. How many others just got listed as lost in the wilderness before we started taking photographs? Chris stood up, suddenly desperate to leave, to put distance between himself and this place. I need to go, I need to, I don't know, think, process. You can't tell anyone, Chris, you know that, right? If this gets out, if people know what's really in that forest, they'll come looking. Hunters, cryptozoologists, thrill seekers, and more people will die. So we just let it continue? Let people disappear? We keep the area closed. We enforce the boundaries. We respect the warnings that should have been respected 100 years ago. Diane's voice was heavy with resignation. It's the best we can do. Chris drove back to his hotel in Port Angeles, his hands shaking on the wheel. The rain continued to fall, and in the darkness the forest pressed close to the highway. Every shadow seemed threatening. Every gap in the trees looked like it might contain something watching. He spent that night in his hotel room, laptop open, researching. Sonokwa, basket woman, the giant woman of Kwakwaka'wakw and Nucha North mythology who lived in the wilderness and collected humans. The stories were consistent across multiple tribal traditions, tall, dark-skinned, hollow-eyed, carrying a basket on her back. Some stories said she ate her victims. Others said she kept them alive in her cave, feeding them her own rancid milk until they became like her. All the stories agreed on one thing: you didn't enter her territory. You respected the boundaries. You left offerings if you had to pass through her lands, and if you heard her cry in the forest, you ran. Chris found historical records of tribal practices, offerings left at the edges of Tsonoqua's territory, cedar bark carvings used as warning markers, rituals to appease her and keep her from venturing too close to villages. And then, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the practices stopped. Missionaries called them superstition. The U.S. government banned many indigenous religious practices. The knowledge faded, but Tsonoqua didn't fade. She just waited. And when humans inevitably crossed into her territory, she did what she had always done. She collected them. Chris's phone buzzed. A text from Diane. Found something. Maka Elder will speak with us tomorrow morning. Says it's important. Can you stay one more day? He should leave. Should get in his truck and drive as far from Olympic National Park as possible. Should return to his normal life of rational explanations and measurable data. But he found himself typing back, "I'll be there." Because Lauren Hutchins was still out there. Maybe in a basket. Maybe in a cave. Maybe already dead. Maybe wishing she was. And Chris's analytical mind, even shattered and reformed by impossible truth, couldn't let go of the idea that there had to be a solution. That night, he dreamed of hollow eyes and gaping mouths, of warning markers carved into every tree in an endless forest, of a basket large enough to hold the world. When he woke at dawn, the rain had finally stopped. But the clouds remained, and Chris knew in his bones that the rain would return. Because in the Olympic forest, the rain never really stopped. It was part of the place, eternal and relentless, washing away evidence and hiding secrets and making sure that some boundaries remained forever unmarked on any official map. He drove back to the ranger station where Diane was waiting with an elderly Maka man. His face was deeply lined, his eyes sharp despite his age. He introduced himself as Thomas Redhawk, and he spoke without preamble. "You crossed the markers. You saw Deoxwalaka, the basket woman. That's why you're here." Chris nodded. "How do we stop it? How do we save the people it's taken?" Thomas's expression was grave. "You don't. Those who enter her basket don't return. They become part of her collection, part of her power. This is the way it has always been." "But there must be something." "There is," Thomas interrupted. "You can restore the boundaries, make new offerings, strengthen the warnings so others won't cross. This is what should have been done long ago." "That's it? We just accept that she's going to keep killing people?" "She doesn't kill. She collects. It's what she is. Fighting her would be like fighting the rain or the tide. You can't win against something that is part of the land itself." Thomas pulled out a leather pouch. "But you can contain her, keep her in her territory. This is cedar bark, blessed in the old ways. You place it at the boundary markers and speak the words I will teach you. Then you leave and you don't come back." Chris looked at Diane. She was pale but determined. "If it means saving lives, even if it means accepting something we can't explain, we have to try." So they learned the words, ancient syllables in a language that predated European contact, that had been spoken in these forests for thousands of years. Prayers of respect and appeasement, acknowledgement of boundaries and territory, and a promise that humans would stay in their world if Deoxwalaka stayed in hers. That afternoon they returned to the forest. This time, they didn't cross the markers. They stayed at the boundary, where the carved bark symbols had been nailed to trees, and they tied new cedar bark blessed by Thomas. They spoke the old words, feeling foolish and terrified in equal measure. And when they were finished, the forest seemed to exhale. The oppressive weight lifted slightly. The silence became less absolute. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called. "It's done," Diane said quietly. "She's been acknowledged. The boundary's been reinforced. And Lauren? Diane's expression was answer enough. Chris drove away from Olympic National Park that evening, and he never returned. He transferred to Great Smoky Mountains National Park 6 months later, telling people he wanted a change of scenery. He didn't tell them about the nightmares, about how he couldn't enter dense forest anymore without feeling watched, about how he'd lost his faith in rational explanation and gained something else in its place, a respect for boundaries both physical and metaphysical. Years later, he would sometimes check the Olympic National Park incident reports online. Disappearances in the Hoh rainforest had dropped to almost zero. The backcountry areas where Lauren had vanished were now officially closed, marked as high-risk avalanche zones, a lie that served a deeper truth. But occasionally there would be reports from hikers who'd stayed on the marked trails, who swore they'd seen something in the deep forest, a tall figure watching from between the trees, the glimpse of a basket, carved symbols that shouldn't be there, and always, the sense that they'd come too close to a boundary that should never be crossed. Christopher Bennett became a cautious man after Olympic. He followed protocols exactly. He respected warning signs, and when people asked him for his most memorable rescue operation, he always changed the subject. Because some searches don't end with rescue, some disappearances don't have explanations that fit into neat reports and rational frameworks, and some entities are older than park boundaries and ranger stations and GPS coordinates, older than the very concept of wilderness that humans had invented to make themselves feel like they understood the world. The rain still falls in the Hoh rainforest, washing away footprints and evidence. The warning markers still stand, though most hikers don't know what they mean. And somewhere in the deep places where the canopy is so thick that noon looks like midnight, where the moss grows over everything and silence reigns, Doxwalaka waits with her basket, patient and eternal, collecting those who cross boundaries that should have been respected long ago. If this story gave you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Chris's place? Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? Tentar novamente. Brandon Reeves stood at the window of the ranger station, watching the first pale light creep across the Brooks Range. The coffee in his hand had gone cold, but he didn't notice. He'd been awake since 3, the dream still clinging to him like frost. Marcus's face in the avalanche, the sound of ice breaking, the way his partner's scream had cut off mid-breath. That had been 4 years ago, in Denali. 4 years. And Brandon could still hear it. He drained the cold coffee and turned away from the window. The routine helped. Check the weather reports, review the patrol sectors, maintain the equipment. In gates of the Arctic National Park, routine was survival. At 35, Brandon had learned that the hard way. The park was 600 miles north of Anchorage, 8 million acres of wilderness that saw maybe 10,000 visitors a year. Most stayed on the edges. The interior was something else entirely. Ancient, unforgiving, and in January 2009, colder than the dark side of the moon. The radio crackled to life at 6:47 a.m. Bettel's station, this is Anaktavuk Pass. We have a situation. The voice was tight. Controlled panic barely held in check. Sarah Chen, the ranger stationed at the village on the park's northern boundary. Brandon keyed the mic. Go ahead, Sarah. Overdue hiker, 27-year-old female, solo backpacker. Name's Kimberly Harrison. She was supposed to check in yesterday at 1600 hours, never showed. Her sat phone's not responding. Solo. In January. In the Brooks Range. Brandon felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. How experienced? That's the thing, she's not some tourist. Wildlife biologist from UC Davis doing her doctorate on Arctic wolf behavior. She's been up here 3 times before. Always professional, always careful. Filed a detailed itinerary. She was researching a pack near Arrogech Creek, about 40 miles northwest of your position. Brandon was already pulling up the topographic maps on his computer, his training overriding the unease. Arrogech Creek drainage, elevation varying from 2,000 to 4,000 feet, temperatures currently sitting at -38 Fahrenheit before wind chill. The wolf pack Sarah mentioned, He knew about them. The Koyukon elders in Anaktuvuk Pass had been talking about that pack for months, saying something was wrong with them, that they'd been acting strange since autumn. When was her last confirmed contact? Day before yesterday, 1800 hours. She radioed that she'd located the pack's winter territory and was setting up observation camp. Standard protocol stuff. Then nothing. 48 hours in this cold. If Kimberly was injured, if she'd lost her shelter. "I'm mobilizing now," Brandon said. "Get me everything. Her exact last known position, her gear manifest, any unusual details from that last contact." "Brandon," Sarah's voice dropped. "There's something else. The elders here, they're saying we shouldn't go looking. They're talking about the Wendigo. They say the wolves have been touched by it." The Koyukon word for Wendigo. Brandon had heard the stories, the way you heard all folklore in Alaska. Part cultural education, part campfire tale. The Algonquian tribes across the northern forests all had versions of it. A malevolent spirit associated with winter, famine, and cannibalism. In the oldest stories, it was what happened when a human consumed human flesh during starvation. They transformed into something else, something that could never be satisfied, eternally hungry. The Koyukon had their own interpretation, brought by intermarriage with Cree and Ojibwe peoples over centuries of trade. "Sarah, I know what we both know," she interrupted. "But the elders are serious. They want to perform a cleansing ceremony before anyone goes into that area. They're talking about taboos being broken, about something wrong in the forest." Brandon thought about Marcus, about how the scientific explanation, unstable snowpack, warming temperatures, bad timing, had never quite filled the hole his death left, about how sometimes in the deep winter dark he wondered if there were things beyond explanation. "Tell the elders I respect their concerns," he said carefully, "but a woman's life is at stake. I'm going. If they want to do a ceremony when I return, I'll participate." The pause on the other end was long enough that Brandon thought he'd lost the connection. Then, "Be careful, Brandon. Please. They say if the Wendigo has already fed, it will still be hungry. They say it will try to make you like it." Brandon signed off, trying to shake the unease that had settled deeper into his bones. He'd been a park ranger for 12 years, a search and rescue specialist before that. He'd seen accidents, exposure deaths, bear attacks, falls. He knew the real dangers of the wilderness: hypothermia, dehydration, equipment failure. Those were the killers, not folklore. But as he packed his gear, the GPS unit that was still somewhat reliable up here despite the latitude, the emergency beacon, the first aid kit, the cold weather sleeping bag rated to -60, the rifle he hoped he wouldn't need, he couldn't quite dismiss Sarah's warning. Alaska Native peoples had survived here for 10,000 years. Their stories came from somewhere. He was on his snowmobile by 8:15 a.m., the sun finally cresting the mountains to the east, turning the snow the color of old bone. The temperature had dropped another 3 degrees. The forecast called for clear skies. Good for searching, terrible for anyone stranded without shelter. At -40, exposed skin froze in minutes. At -50, breath froze in the air and fell as ice crystals. The run to Arrogech Creek would take him 5 hours across terrain that barely qualified as terrain. Frozen river valleys, spruce forests so thick with snow they looked like alien cathedrals, mountain passes where the wind could strip flesh from bone. Brandon knew every mile of it. He'd patrolled this sector for 3 years ever since transferring from Denali, ever since Marcus. The first 3 hours passed in the grinding monotony of winter travel. Maintain speed, watch for hazards, keep the machine running. The spruce gave way to willows, then open tundra, then more spruce. The Brooks Range rose around him, jagged peaks that looked like broken teeth against the sky. No birds, no movement, just white and silence, and the howl of his engine. He was 40 minutes from Kimberly's last known position when he saw the first wolf. It was standing on a ridge about 200 yards to his north, silhouetted against the snow. Too far to make out details, but the posture was wrong. Wolves didn't stand like that, rigid, head canted at an angle that made Brandon think of broken necks. He'd seen hundreds of wolves in his career. This one radiated wrongness. He cut the engine. In the sudden silence, he could hear his own breathing, loud and harsh in his throat. The wolf, if it was a wolf, didn't move. Just stood there, watching. Brandon pulled out his binoculars with gloved hands gone clumsy in the cold. Through the lenses, details sharpened. The wolf was massive, easily over 150 pounds. But its fur looked patchy, as if molting despite the season. And its ribs. Christ, he could count every rib despite the thick winter coat. The animal looked like it was starving, but it was the eyes that made Brandon's breath catch. Even at this distance, even through the binoculars, he could see they were wrong, too aware, too focused, watching him with an intelligence that wolves didn't possess. He'd lowered the binoculars and was reaching for his rifle when the wolf opened its mouth. The sound that came out wasn't a howl. It was higher, more complex, almost like a human voice screaming through a wolf's throat. The sound carried across the tundra, bouncing off the mountains, multiplying until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then the wolf turned and loped into the forest with that same wrong gait, and Brandon was alone again with his hammering heart and the memory of that sound. He tried to tell himself it was just acoustics, just the way sound traveled in these mountains, but his hand shook as he restarted the snowmobile. Kimberly's camp was exactly where her GPS coordinates said it would be. A small clearing in a stand of spruce about 300 yards from the frozen creek. Brandon approached slowly, every sense alert. The camp was intact. Tent still standing, equipment neatly arranged, sled with supplies covered and secured. Everything looked normal from a distance. But there was no smoke from a fire, no sign of recent activity. And the snow around the camp. Brandon killed the engine and sat for a moment, staring. The snow around the camp was disturbed, but not by wind. There were tracks everywhere, overlapping and chaotic. Human tracks. Wolf tracks. Something else that looked almost like human footprints but elongated with claw marks at the toe. And there was blood. Not much, just dark spots in the snow, already frozen, leading from the tent toward the creek. Brandon's training took over. He approached on foot, rifle ready, documenting everything with his camera. The tent first. The zipper was open from the inside, not torn. Kimberly's sleeping bag was there, her personal items, her research notes in a waterproof case, but her parka was gone. Her boots were gone. The emergency supplies she should have kept in the tent, the backup radio, the flares, the first aid kit, all gone. She'd left intentionally. In the middle of the night, based on the frozen condensation inside the tent. She'd taken essential gear and walked out. Why? Brandon checked the research notes. The last entry was dated 2 days ago, time-stamped 9:47 p.m. Kimberly's handwriting was precise, scientific. Day 23. Located the Alpha Pair's den site. Pack behavior continues to deteriorate. Counted 7 individuals down from original 9 tracked in October. The 2 missing members. The entry stopped mid-sentence. Brandon flipped through the previous pages. Kimberly had been documenting increasingly bizarre behavior in the wolf pack. Aggressive encounters with each other. Consumption of pack members' remains. Refusal to eat normal prey. A pattern that reminded Brandon uncomfortably of disease. Rabies, maybe, or some prion disorder like chronic wasting disease. But wolves didn't get CWD. And rabies didn't present like this. One entry from a week ago stood out. Met with elders from Anaktavuk Pass. They warned me to leave this area. Spoke about corruption of the animal spirits. About something wrong in the forest that makes creatures empty inside. Showed me carved tokens of protection. Offered to perform a blessing ceremony. Declined politely, but they seemed genuinely frightened. Not for themselves, for me. Said the wolves were learning to speak. Said they were being taught by something older. Brandon's hands had gone numb. He shoved the notes in his pack and forced himself to move, to think. The blood trail. Follow the blood trail. It led toward Arrogech Creek, crossing through dense spruce where the snow was shallower, protected by the canopy. The tracks were clearer here. Kimberly's boot prints definitely, size 7. distinctive tread from her sorrels. She'd been moving fast, stumbling, breaking branches, running, but the other tracks, those elongated clawed prints, were right beside hers, sometimes behind, sometimes in front, as if whatever made them had been circling her, hurting her. Brandon followed for a quarter mile, his unease growing with every step. The blood spots were becoming more frequent, and there were other signs. Broken branches at shoulder height with what looked like frozen saliva on them, deep gouges in tree bark that didn't match any animal he knew, and worst of all, scattered pieces of what might have been clothing. He was thinking about calling Sarah, about requesting backup even though the nearest help was hours away, when he found the first marker. It was hanging from a spruce branch about 7 feet off the ground, a crude figure made of twisted willow branches and what looked like wolf fur bound together with sinew. It spun slowly in the wind, casting weird shadows on the snow. Brandon had seen plenty of native ritual objects in his years in Alaska. This wasn't like any of them. This was older, cruder, made by hands that barely remembered being hands. There were symbols scratched into the bark of the tree beneath it. Not Koyukon, not any language Brandon recognized. Just angular marks that hurt to look at, that seemed to squirm at the edge of his vision. He took pictures with shaking hands and kept moving. The second marker was 50 yards farther. The third was at the creek's edge. They formed a path, a trail marked in profane signposts. And between each marker, more of those tracks, more blood, and something new. Frozen chunks of what might have been meat, gnawed and discarded. Brandon knelt beside one, bile rising in his throat. The flesh was human. He could see the pores in the skin, the suggestion of fingerprints. He radioed Sarah immediately, his voice hoarse. "I've found evidence of... I need you to contact the state troopers. This is now a crime scene. Possible homicide." "Brandon, what did you find?" He couldn't say it, couldn't put words to what he was looking at. Evidence of cannibalism in the Arctic in 2009, in a woman who by all accounts had been competent and rational 72 hours ago. "Just get them here. And Sarah, those elders. Ask them what happens if someone breaks the taboo. Ask them what happens if someone eats..." He couldn't finish, but Sarah's sharp intake of breath told him she understood. "Oh God. Brandon, get out of there. Right now. Don't look for her anymore, just..." The radio dissolved into static. Brandon tried to switch frequencies, but every channel was dead. He checked the battery, full charge, checked the connections, all solid. The radio should have been working. Instead, all he got was that static, and underneath it, so faint he thought he might be imagining it, something that sounded like breathing. He was standing there, staring at the useless radio, when he heard the voice from across the creek. Brandon, it was Kimberly's voice. He knew it was Kimberly's voice because he'd listened to her check-in recordings that Sarah had forwarded. But it wasn't quite right. The pitch was off, the inflection wrong, like someone who'd learned to mimic human speech but didn't understand the mechanics. "Brandon, I'm so cold, please help me." She was standing on the far bank, maybe 60 yards away, mostly hidden in the spruce shadows. She'd lost her parka, and her shirt hung in tatters. Even at this distance, Brandon could see she was impossibly thin, skeletal, her skin pulled tight over bones that shouldn't be visible. Her hair had fallen out in patches. But she was alive, moving, speaking. "Kimberly," his voice cracked. "Stay there. I'm coming to help you." He started toward the creek, mind already racing through the protocols. Advanced hypothermia, possible frostbite, clear signs of starvation. How had she survived 2 days in this cold? What had she been eating? He was halfway across the ice when she tilted her head at that same wrong angle the wolf had used and smiled. Her teeth were red. "So hungry, Brandon. So hungry all the time. Can you understand? The hunger never stops. Even when I eat and eat and eat, it just grows bigger." Brandon stopped. The ice beneath him groaned. "Kimberly, you need medical attention. Let me help you." "You can help me." She took a step forward into a shaft of sunlight, and Brandon saw what had been done to her, what she'd done to herself. Her fingers ended in broken nails worn down to bleeding stubs from digging. Her lips were shredded from gnawing. And the bones, Christ. The bones jutting from her chest and hips weren't just visible through malnutrition. They'd burst through the skin, jagged and sharp, as if her skeleton was trying to escape. "You can feed me," she said, and her voice dropped into a register no human throat should produce. Like I fed it. Like it taught me to feed. Behind her, other shapes moved in the forest. Not quite human, not quite wolf. The pack, Brandon realized with rising horror. The pack that had learned to speak. He ran. Later he wouldn't remember the details, just fragments. Crashing through the spruce, his snowshoes tangling, falling, scrambling up. The sounds behind him, voices that mimicked human speech but got the words wrong. "Stop running food, please, we help you, Brandon, stop, stop, stop." The markers hanging from every tree now, spinning and spinning. The moment he burst from the forest and saw his snowmobile right where he'd left it, still intact like something was playing with him. He made it 3 miles before his engine died. No mechanical failure, no explanation. It just stopped, and no amount of cursing or checking could make it start again. Brandon activated his emergency beacon and started walking south, toward Bettles, toward anything resembling civilization. He had maybe 5 hours of daylight left. The temperature was dropping again. He could cover maybe 12 miles before he'd need to make camp, and he was still 40 miles from the nearest human settlement. The voices followed him through the twilight. Sometimes Kimberly's, sometimes Marcus's, once horribly. His own mother's voice calling him home for dinner like she had when he was 8. The wolves, things that had been wolves, paced him through the trees, always just at the edge of vision, their ribs showing through fur matted with ice and worse things. He tried not to think about what Kimberly had become, tried not to think about the anthropological papers he'd read about Wendigo psychosis, the culture-bound syndrome documented among Algonquian peoples, where people became convinced they needed to consume human flesh. Science explained it as a combination of harsh winters, periodic famines, and cultural conditioning. Science said it wasn't real. Science didn't explain what had happened to those wolves, or the markers, or the thing wearing Kimberly Harrison's face while her body consumed itself from within, with a hunger that could never be satisfied. As darkness fell and the temperature plunged toward -50, Brandon made camp in a small depression that offered minimal protection from the wind. He couldn't risk a fire. The light would draw them. Instead, he huddled in his sleeping bag, rifle across his chest, and listened to the sounds of the forest. They were out there, circling, waiting. "Brandon," Kimberly's voice drifting through the spruce. "It hurts so much, why won't you help me? Why won't you feed me?" Then Marcus's voice. "It's not so bad, buddy. Once you give in, once you take that first bite, the fear stops. The guilt stops. There's only the hunger, and the hunger is honest, the hunger is real." His mother's voice. "Baby, I made your favorite. Don't you want to come home? Don't you want to taste?" And beneath it all, a sound like grinding ice, like cracking bones, like a million starving mouths trying to form words they'd forgotten. Brandon closed his eyes and thought about the Koyukon elders, about their warnings, about traditions that stretched back millennia. The Wendigo wasn't just a monster in their stories. It was a cautionary tale about what happened when humans broke the ultimate taboo, about what happened when survival demanded the unthinkable, and people discovered that some prices were too high to ever finish paying. Kimberly had been studying wolves exhibiting cannibalistic behavior. Had she gotten too close? Had she witnessed something she shouldn't have? Or had the wolves themselves been touched by something older, something that infected anything it encountered, teaching them the hunger that could never be sated? In those long hours of Arctic night, Brandon understood something the scientific literature had never captured. The Wendigo wasn't about cannibalism. It was about emptiness. About becoming so hollow that you'd consume anything. Friend, family, self, trying to fill the void. About the moment when you realized you'd crossed a line that erased your humanity, and the terrible freedom that came with that knowledge. He must have dozed because when he jerked awake, the first gray light of dawn was bleeding across the sky. His emergency beacon was gone. His radio was gone. Even his spare batteries had vanished, and there were tracks all around his camp, dozens of them, circling and circling, those elongated human, not human prints in the snow. They'd been right there, inches away, while he slept. But they hadn't touched him. Brandon stumbled to his feet, joints screaming in the cold, and started walking again. South. Always south. He'd left everything behind, the tent, the sleeping bag, all his gear except the rifle and the clothes on his back. None of it mattered. He had to move. Had to keep moving. The sun rose higher but brought no warmth. His face was numb, his fingers clumsy in his gloves. Frostbite setting in. He knew the symptoms. Knew he had maybe 6 hours before it became critical. The voices stayed with him, patient now, almost gentle. Brandon, you can't make it. You know you can't. You're 40 miles from anywhere. It's minus 45 degrees. You're already frostbitten. Kimberly's voice, reasonable and kind. Just rest. Just for a minute. Close your eyes. We'll take care of everything. We'll take care of you. Marcus's voice, brotherly and concerned. But Brandon kept walking, one foot in front of the other, not thinking about Kimberly's bones bursting through her skin, not thinking about the wolves that had learned to speak, not thinking about the markers that multiplied in the forest behind him, a profane trail that would lead anyone who followed straight into the same horror. He was hallucinating now. He knew he was hallucinating, because he kept seeing Marcus walking beside him, solid and real, wearing the jacket he'd died in. You couldn't save me, Marcus said conversationally. And you can't save yourself, but you could save her. Kimberly, if you go back. If you give her what she needs. She's gone, Brandon whispered through cracked lips. Whatever that thing is, it's not Kimberly anymore. Are you sure? Maybe she's just hungry. Maybe if she could just eat one more time, just fill that emptiness, she'd be herself again. Isn't it worth trying? Brandon's legs gave out. He fell face first into the snow and couldn't get up. His fingers wouldn't work. His legs wouldn't work. The cold had finally won. He rolled onto his back and stared at the sky. Painfully blue, cloudless, beautiful. He thought about calling out, about screaming for help. But who would hear? The only ears in 40 miles belonged to things that were no longer entirely animal, taught by something that had been waiting in this forest since before humans built fires to keep it at bay. The shapes emerged from the trees one by one. 7 of them, what was left of the wolf pack. They'd once been apex predators, magnificent creatures adapted to survive in the harshest environment on Earth. Now they were something else. Their eyes reflected intelligence and madness in equal measure. Their bodies were emaciated despite being stained with evidence of feeding. The hunger, Brandon understood, wasn't about calories. It was about something deeper, something metaphysical. An emptiness that grew larger with every attempt to fill it. Behind them, Kimberly stepped into the clearing. She'd eaten more of herself since yesterday. Her left hand was gone, gnawed to the wrist, but she was still moving, still walking, animated by something that refused to let her die even as it consumed her from within. I tried to fight it, she said, and for a moment her voice was purely her own, young, scared, human. When it started, when I realized what was happening to me. I tried so hard, Brandon, but the hunger, it gets inside your head. It becomes all you are. And eventually you start to think maybe it's not so wrong. Maybe it's just another kind of truth. Brandon's rifle was somewhere under him. He couldn't feel his hands anymore, couldn't move his arms. All he could do was lie there and watch as Kimberly knelt beside him. I'm sorry, she said, and he thought she meant it. I'm so sorry. Then she opened her mouth, wider than should have been possible, her jaw unhinging like a snake's, and leaned forward. The helicopter found him 3 hours later. Later, the medical team would call it a miracle. Brandon Reeves, severely frostbitten, hypothermic, suffering from exposure-induced psychosis, but alive. found 15 miles from where his emergency beacon had last pinged, curled in a fetal position in the snow, screaming about hunger. They never found Kimberly Harrison. The search teams that went to Arrogetch Creek found her camp, found evidence of her presence, but no body, no blood trail, no markers hanging from trees. The wolves in the area appeared normal, if slightly underweight. The elders from Manaktavuk Pass refused to participate in the search. They performed a cleansing ceremony at the edge of the search area and warned that anyone who went farther would bring the corruption back with them. The official report cited exposure, hypothermia-induced hallucinations, and possible bear activity in the area. Kimberly Harrison was listed as lost to the wilderness, presumed dead. The case was closed within 6 weeks. Brandon spent 2 months in psychiatric care in Anchorage. They saved his hands, but he lost 3 toes to frostbite. The nightmares were worse. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Kimberly's face, heard her voice explaining the hunger, saw Marcus walking beside him in the snow. He never went back to Gates of the Arctic. He resigned from the Park Service and moved to Portland, where the forest was tame and logged and safe, where winter was gray rain instead of killing cold, where nothing watched from the trees with eyes that had learned the wrong kind of hunger. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind rattles his windows and the darkness presses close, he hears it, a voice that sounds almost like Kimberly's, or almost like Marcus's, or almost like his own, calling to him, reminding him. The hunger is still out there, waiting, growing, teaching the wilderness its ancient lesson about emptiness and consumption, about what happens when the taboo is broken and the line between human and monster dissolves. And sometimes, Brandon won't admit this to his therapist, won't say it out loud. Sometimes he understands the appeal, the freedom of giving in, the honest simplicity of becoming nothing but appetite, the way it would end all the guilt and fear and grief that Marcus's death left behind. That's the real horror of the Wendigo. Not that it exists, but that it offers an answer, a terrible answer, but an answer nonetheless. And in the deepest part of himself, in the place where he keeps the truth about those 48 hours in the Brooks Range, Brandon knows he came closer to accepting that answer than he'll ever tell anyone. Knows that if Kimberly had leaned a little closer, if her teeth had found his throat, if she'd whispered the secret of how to make the pain stop, he might have said yes. He still might. The hunger is patient. The hunger is forever. And somewhere in Alaska, in 8 million acres of winter wilderness, it's still teaching the wolves to speak. If this story gave you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you have survived in Brandon's place? Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most? The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days when Sarah Reeves received the call that would unravel everything she thought she understood about the natural world. She was cataloging moss samples in her makeshift field laboratory, a weathered ranger station at the edge of Olympic National Park's Kano sector, when her satellite phone crackled to life with her sister's voice, brittle with barely controlled panic. Tyler was missing. Her nephew, 23 and invincible in the way young men always believed themselves to be, had gone into the Hoh rainforest 2 days ago on what was supposed to be a routine wildlife photography expedition. His last GPS ping had come from somewhere near the old Kinol burial grounds, a location that made the park rangers exchange uncomfortable glances when Sarah mentioned it during the emergency briefing. Sarah was a field biologist specializing in Pacific Northwest ecosystems, not a search and rescue expert, but she knew these forests better than most. She'd spent 5 years studying decomposition rates and nutrient cycling in old-growth temperate rainforests, which meant she understood exactly how quickly this environment could swallow a person. The Hoh received over 12 feet of rain annually. The understory was so dense that helicopters were useless. If Tyler was injured or disoriented, every hour mattered. What she didn't tell her sister, what she barely admitted to herself, was the feeling that had settled into her chest the moment she heard which area Tyler had been exploring. It wasn't scientific, it wasn't rational. But Sarah had spent enough time in these woods to recognize when something felt fundamentally wrong. The search team assembled at dawn on the 4th day. Sarah, 2 park rangers named Marcus Webb and Jennifer Okafor, and a Quino tribal liaison named Thomas Kalama, who'd insisted on joining, despite having no official SAR training. Marcus was a veteran with 20 years in the Park Service, his weathered face suggesting he'd seen plenty of people come back from these woods and plenty who hadn't. Jennifer was younger, methodical, the kind of person who checked her equipment 3 times before any expedition. Thomas was perhaps 60, with silver threading through his black hair and eyes that seemed to catalog everything without ever appearing to stare. "The area your nephew was exploring," Thomas said quietly as they geared up, speaking directly to Sarah. "It's been off limits to my people for generations. There are reasons for that." Sarah appreciated the cultural sensitivity, but she needed facts, not folklore. "What kind of reasons?" "The kind that kept our ancestors alive." Thomas adjusted his pack with practiced efficiency. "There are burial sites there, yes, but also other things. Places where the boundary is thin, where the old agreements still hold." He paused, meeting her eyes. "Your nephew in his photographs, was he the type to disturb things? Move objects for better composition?" The question sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the 40-degree temperature. Tyler was exactly that type. She'd watched him rearrange entire tide pools for the perfect shot, arguing that everything was temporary anyway, that nature would reset itself. She'd tried to teach him about leave-no-trace principles, but Tyler saw the world as his canvas. "He's a photographer," Sarah said carefully. "He's enthusiastic about his art." Thomas's expression darkened. "Then we need to move quickly, and we need to be very careful about what we touch." The hike into the Ho took 4 hours, following Tyler's GPS trail through terrain that grew progressively more oppressive. The rainforest was beautiful in its way. Massive Sitka spruces draped in club moss, big leaf maples covered in ferns, every surface carpeted in green. But the beauty was suffocating. The canopy blocked so much light that the forest floor existed in perpetual twilight. Sound died within feet, absorbed by countless layers of vegetation. Sarah's scientific mind knew this was simply the result of optimal growing conditions and acoustic dampening. But another part of her, something more primitive, recognized this as predator territory. This was an environment designed for things to disappear. They found Tyler's first camp at the 2-hour mark, a hastily abandoned site with his tent still standing, sleeping bag half out of its stuff sack, gear scattered. Nothing overtly wrong, but Marcus immediately tensed. "This isn't right," he said, crouching by the tent. "No bear signs, no struggle, but look at this." He gestured to the sleeping bag. "Someone doesn't leave camp in the middle of the night without taking their primary insulation. Not in October." Jennifer was examining the ground with her flashlight despite the gray daylight. "No prints leading away from the tent. I mean, there are prints, but they're..." "Sarah, come look at this." Sarah joined her, expecting to see Tyler's boot treads. Instead, she found something that made her analytical mind stutter. The prints were human-shaped, but wrong. The spacing was too wide, the depth too shallow in places and too deep in others, as if something had been walking on tiptoes and then suddenly bearing down with enormous weight. And they didn't lead anywhere sensible. They circled the tent 3 times, then appeared to simply stop at the base of a massive cedar. "Could be a transient," Marcus offered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Someone high on drugs, walking strangely, in the middle of nowhere, circling a tent and then climbing a tree?" Sarah stood, looking up into the cedar's massive crown. "That doesn't make sense." "None of this makes sense," Jennifer muttered. She was holding something. Tyler's camera, lens cap still on, hanging from a broken strap. "Found this 10 feet from the tent. Why would he leave his camera?" Thomas had been silent, standing at the edge of the clearing with his head tilted as if listening. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight. "We need to check his photographs, the digital file. Now, before we go any further." Sarah took the camera, her hand surprisingly steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. She powered it on, navigating to the image gallery. The last photos were time-stamped at 11:47 p.m. 3 nights ago, which didn't make sense because Tyler had told his mother he'd be asleep by 9, needing rest for an early shoot. The photos made Sarah's skin crawl. They showed the Kino burial site, which Tyler had clearly found despite it being deliberately unmarked on any maps. Ancient cedar platforms elevated in trees, traditional burial boxes weathered by centuries of rain. But Tyler had done more than photograph them. The sequential images showed him climbing up to one of the platforms, opening a burial box, removing objects. In the harsh glare of his flash, Sarah could see him holding up artifacts. A carved wooden mask, woven cedar bark, what looked like bone implements, arranging them on the ground in artistic compositions, surrounding himself with items that had been placed with specific ceremonial purpose generations ago. "Jesus Christ, Tyler," Sarah whispered. The final photograph was the worst. It showed Tyler's campsite, but taken from an impossible angle, at least 20 feet up in a tree looking directly down at his tent. The camera's night vision mode had activated, rendering everything in shades of green. And there, barely visible in the lower right corner of the frame, was a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was human-shaped, but not human. Too thin, limbs too long, head tilted at an angle that suggested a neck with too many vertebrae. But worst of all was what the figure appeared to be doing. Its torso was opened, split from throat to groin, and something was emerging. The image was blurry, but Sarah's mind filled in details she desperately didn't want to see. "That's not possible," she said, her scientist's brain rejecting what her eyes clearly showed. "Camera glitch, digital artifact. Has to be." Thomas took the camera from her hands gently. He looked at the image for a long moment, his face going gray. "Stikini," he said quietly. "I'd hoped I was wrong." "Stikini?" Jennifer asked. "Not our tradition originally. Comes from Seminole peoples, far south of here. But the concept exists in many forms. My grandmother's grandmother spoke of something similar. Witches who could remove their internal organs, hide them, and transform to hunt at night. They fly as owls. They consume the dying and the lost." Thomas's voice was steady, but Sarah could see his hands trembling slightly. "The burial grounds Tyler disturbed. There's a reason they were sealed with specific ceremonies. Some of those buried there were suspected of dark practices. The agreements that bound them required their remains to be undisturbed, offerings to be maintained, protocols to be followed." "This is insane," Sarah said, hearing the sharp edge in her own voice. "We're talking about a missing person, not folklore." "Then explain the photograph," Thomas said simply. Sarah couldn't. That was the problem. Her rational mind was throwing up explanations. Hoax, doctored image, hallucination. But her gut, that primitive part of her brain that had kept humans alive for millennia, was screaming at her that what she was seeing was real. Marcus made the decision for them. "Whether it's a witch or a psychopath, we've got a missing person and evidence he pissed off something dangerous. We follow his trail, we find Tyler, we get the hell out. Jennifer, you're documenting everything. Sarah, you're our tracker. You know this forest best. Thomas," he paused, "if this is what you say it is, what do we do? Don't separate. Don't go out after dark. Don't disturb anything else. And if we find the organs..." Thomas swallowed hard. "If we find where it's hidden its organs, we destroy them. That's the only way to kill it while it's transformed." They pushed deeper into the forest, following a trail that became increasingly disturbing. Tyler's boot prints appeared and disappeared randomly, sometimes showing him running, sometimes showing him walking in circles. They found his jacket torn to pieces and hanging from a branch 15 feet up. They found pages from his journal scattered across a game trail, the handwriting deteriorating from Tyler's usual neat print to desperate scrawls. "It knows I touched them, and can't sleep. It watches from the trees." And finally, in letters so pressed into the paper they'd torn through, "She wants them back." Sarah kept walking, kept analyzing, kept looking for rational explanations, even as the evidence mounted against rationality. The forest itself seemed to be changing around them. The bird calls that had been constant background noise fell silent. The usual rustle of small mammals in the understory ceased. Even the ever-present drip of condensation from the canopy seemed to slow, as if the forest were holding its breath. They found the burial site at dusk, which was the last thing any of them wanted. The platforms were exactly as shown in Tyler's photos, but now the disturbed burial box stood open, its contents spread across the forest floor in obvious disarray. Someone, Tyler presumably, had taken the artifacts and then returned them, but carelessly, without ceremony. Bones lay scattered. The cedar mask was cracked. And in the center of it all was a message spelled out in small white stones. "I'm sorry." "He tried to fix it," Jennifer said softly. "He realized what he'd done and tried to put everything back. Too late." Thomas was examining the burial box, his face grave. "These ceremonies, the unbinding takes seconds. The rebinding takes days of proper ritual. Whatever was contained here is free now." A sound cut through the forest, high and wavering, something between a scream and a bird call. It came from above them, from the canopy, and it was moving. Sarah's head snapped up, her flashlight beam cutting through the gathering darkness, catching brief glimpses of movement between branches. Something large, something that shouldn't exist. "Lights off," Thomas hissed. "Now!" They killed their flashlights, plunging into darkness broken only by the faint gray remnants of twilight filtering through the canopy. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Her scientific training screamed at her that this was absurd, that they were reacting to an owl or a large bird startled by their presence. But she'd heard owls. She'd cataloged every bird species in Olympic National Park. This wasn't that. The sound came again, closer, and with it a smell that made Sarah's gorge rise. Rot and bile and something acrid she couldn't identify. In the darkness, she heard the distinctive sound of something wet hitting the forest floor. Once, twice, 3 times. Heavy organic sounds. "It's setting down its organs," Thomas whispered, barely audible. "It has to put them back before it can transform fully. Stay absolutely still." Sarah's every instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to remain frozen. In the darkness, her other senses sharpened. She could hear breathing, ragged and wet, too close. She could hear the rustle of something moving through the understory with a strange, lurching gait. And then, impossibly, she heard Tyler's voice. "Sarah? Aunt Sarah, is that you?" Every muscle in her body tensed. That was Tyler's voice, perfect in inflection and tone. But there was something underneath it, something off in a way she couldn't articulate. It was like listening to a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. "Sarah, I'm hurt. I need help. Please, I can't find my way back." Marcus's hand clamped on her arm, holding her in place. In the darkness, she felt rather than saw Thomas slowly, carefully, reaching into his pack. The voice came again, and this time Sarah realized what was wrong with it. There was no directionality. It didn't come from a specific point in space. It seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, from the trees themselves. "Aunt Sarah, why won't you help me? Don't you love me? I'm scared, I'm so scared, please." Sarah's analytical mind kicked in despite her terror, cataloging what she was hearing. Mimicry, vocal manipulation, predator behavior designed to draw prey closer. She'd seen it in nature. Anglerfish with lures, alligator snapping turtles with tongue appendages that looked like worms. But this was different. This was intelligent. This was malicious. A flashlight clicked on. Jennifer, breaking protocol in panic. The beam swept across the clearing and caught something that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. It stood perhaps 20 feet away, in the space between 2 massive cedars. Human-shaped, but wrong in every proportion. The skin was gray-white, translucent, pulled too tight over bones that seemed to shift and reconfigure as Sarah watched. The torso gaped open, a vertical wound from throat to pelvis revealing an empty cavity. At its feet lay a pile of organs, lungs, intestines, a liver, all still glistening and moving with apparent life despite being outside their host. But it was the face that destroyed something fundamental in Sarah's worldview. Because it was Tyler's face, not mimicking Tyler, not wearing Tyler's skin, but somehow configured into Tyler's exact features while remaining utterly, fundamentally other. The eyes were too large, too dark, pools of absolute black that reflected Jennifer's flashlight beam like an animal's tapetum lucidum. And when it smiled, when that thing arranged Tyler's features into an expression of greeting, Sarah saw teeth that were too sharp, too numerous, a mouth that opened too wide. "Found me," it said in Tyler's voice, but now without any pretense of humanity. "Clever Sarah, smart Sarah, Sarah who studies death and decay. Do you understand yet? Do you see?" Jennifer was screaming. Marcus was fumbling for his radio. But Thomas moved with purpose, pulling something from his pack, a small leather pouch and a container of what looked like salt. "It's not him!" Thomas shouted. "Your nephew is dead. This thing is wearing his death." The creature, the Stakini, laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking underwater. Dead? Not dead. Not yet. Still dying. Still screaming inside what's left. Want to hear? And then it made a sound that Sarah knew with absolute certainty was Tyler truly screaming, somewhere in the darkness, somewhere close, still alive and experiencing something worse than death. Sarah's paralysis broke. She surged forward, not thinking, only needing to reach her nephew, but Marcus tackled her from the side, driving her into the wet undergrowth. "That's what it wants," he shouted in her ear. "It's hunting. Don't let it separate us." Thomas was moving in a circle, pouring salt in a continuous line, speaking rapidly in a language Sarah didn't recognize. The Stakini watched him with those terrible black eyes, its head tilting at angles that would break a human neck. "Old words," it said, still in Tyler's voice. "Old ways, but I am older. Older than your grandmother's grandmother. Older than the trees. I was bound, yes, contained, yes. But your nephew freed me. Touched what shouldn't be touched. Broke what shouldn't be broken. And now..." It reached down, gathering its organs, beginning to feed them back into its gaping torso. "Now I am whole again. And there are 4 of you. 4 to consume. 4 to carry with me. 4 new voices to speak with." The transformation was worse than the revelation. Sarah watched, unable to look away as the creature folded its organs back inside itself, the wound sealing with obscene wet sounds. Its bones cracked and reformed, its skin rippled and shifted. And when it was done, standing before them was something that looked almost human, almost like Tyler, except for the eyes that remained black and empty. "Run," Thomas said quietly, still pouring his circle. "When I break the line, you run east. Don't look back. Don't stop. There's a ranger station 12 miles that way. Lock yourselves in. Wait for dawn. We're not leaving you," Jennifer said, her voice high and thin. "You are." Thomas met Sarah's eyes. "I'm Kinault. This thing is in my territory, unleashed by violation of my people's sacred spaces. It's my responsibility. And I know rituals that might bind it again. But I need time, so you run." The Stakini that wore Tyler's face smiled wider. Noble, foolish, delicious. Thomas broke the salt line with his foot and screamed, "Go!" They ran. Sarah had hiked these forests for years, but running through them at night was like running through a nightmare made solid. Roots caught at her feet. Branches whipped her face. The darkness was absolute beneath the canopy, forcing them to rely on their flashlights, which made them targets. Behind them, she could hear sounds. Thomas chanting, the Stakini laughing, and then screaming. So much screaming. Marcus led, GPS in hand. Jennifer behind him. Sarah bringing up the rear. They ran in silence except for their ragged breathing and the crash of their passage through the understory. Sarah's mind was racing, trying to process what she'd seen, trying to fit it into her understanding of the world, failing spectacularly. Every principle of biology, every law of physics she'd ever learned, shattered against the reality of what she'd just witnessed. They'd covered maybe 2 miles when Jennifer fell, her ankle turning on a hidden root. She went down hard, crying out, and Marcus skidded to a stop. Sarah helped her up, but Jennifer couldn't put weight on her left foot. "I can't," Jennifer gasped. "I can't run. You have to. We're not leaving anyone else," Sarah said firmly, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. Her rational mind might be broken, but her humanity wasn't. "Marcus, help me. We'll carry her." They tried. They got another 1/4 mile, Jennifer supported between them, before they heard it. the sound of massive wings beating through the canopy above them, and then Tyler's voice, coming from directly overhead. "Aunt Sarah, where are you going? Don't you want to find me? Don't you want to save me?" Marcus killed his flashlight. Sarah killed hers. They stood in absolute darkness, Jennifer whimpering softly between them, and listened as something large circled above them. The wing beats were enormous, suggesting something the size of a horse, something that shouldn't be able to fly but did anyway because it didn't care about Sarah's understanding of lift and weight ratios. "I can smell you," the voice said, still Tyler's but now with something else woven through it. Thomas's accent, his intonation. Thomas tasted of duty, of obligation. "He's part of me now. And soon you will be too. All your knowledge, Sarah. All your beautiful analytical mind. I'll wear it. Use it. Add it to the collection." A sound of impact, something hitting the ground hard enough to shake the earth. It was close. Too close. Sarah's night-adapted eyes could just make out a shape moving between the trees, something that moved wrong, that flowed rather than walked. "The station is too far," Marcus whispered directly into Sarah's ear. "It knows where we're going. It'll pick us off before we're halfway. We need another plan." "The burial site," Sarah whispered back, her mind working frantically. "Thomas said to destroy its organs. If it's consumed Thomas, it had to put them back first, which means it has them inside it now. But to fly it has to remove them again. It has to hide them somewhere safe while it's transformed." "You want to go back?" Jennifer hissed. "Are you insane?" "I'm a scientist," Sarah said, and something in her was calming, crystallizing, finding solid ground in analysis even in the face of the impossible. "It hunts. It's a predator. Predators have patterns. It hid its organs at the burial site originally because that's its anchor point. That's where it was bound. If we can get back there while it's hunting us, if we can find and destroy the organs, it dies," Marcus finished. "Fuck. That's a hell of a gamble. Do you have a better idea?" The shape was getting closer. They could hear it now, breathing in a rhythm that suggested lungs that had no right to function. And other sounds, wet sounds, grinding sounds, the click of too many joints bending. "We split up," Marcus decided. "Jennifer and I will draw it east, make it think we're still running for the station. Sarah, you're fastest and you know the terrain. You circle back to the burial site. You find those organs and you burn them, bury them, do whatever it takes to destroy them. We'll buy you as much time as we can." "No," Sarah said. "I can't." "You can and you will," Marcus said firmly. "Because you're the only one who might actually pull this off. Jennifer can't run, I'm not leaving her, that means you're our only shot. So you make it count." Sarah wanted to argue. Every part of her wanted to stay together. Safety in numbers, all the principles she'd ever learned. But Marcus was right. This was their only play. "On 3, Marcus whispered. 1, 2, 3. He clicked on his flashlight, screaming, crashing through the forest in the opposite direction. Jennifer limped alongside him, adding her voice to his, making as much noise as two people possibly could. And the thing that had been Tyler and Thomas, the Stikini, the ancient evil that should not exist, took the bait. Sarah heard it launch, heard the massive wing beats, heard it surge after the noise, and then she ran. Not away from the horror, but back toward it, back toward the burial site, back toward the only chance any of them had. The run back took forever, and no time at all. Sarah's flashlight carved a tunnel through the darkness, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her mind focused on one thing. Get to the organs. Destroy them. End this. Behind her, in the distance, she heard screaming. Marcus or Jennifer, she couldn't tell. She forced herself not to think about it, forced herself to focus. The burial site appeared like something from a fever dream. The platforms were still there, still bearing their disturbed boxes. The artifacts were still scattered. But now there was something new, a pile of fresh earth at the base of the largest cedar, and partially buried in that earth, wrapped in what looked like strips of cedar bark, was a bundle. Sarah didn't let herself hesitate. She dropped to her knees, digging with her bare hands, pulling the bundle free. It was heavy, warm, pulsing with something that felt like heartbeat but wrong, syncopated, multiple rhythms overlapping. The cedar bark wrapping was tied with sinew that looked disturbingly human. She tore it open. The organs inside were still alive. They shifted and moved. Lungs that breathed despite having no body. A heart that beat despite having no circulatory system. Intestines that writhed like snakes. Sarah's gorge rose, but she forced it down. This was biology. Impossible biology. Biology that broke every rule but still biology. And biology could be destroyed. She had a lighter in her pack, always carried one, emergency fire starting. She pulled it out, flicked it to life, and applied the flame to the organs. They didn't just burn, they screamed. The sound was like nothing Sarah had ever heard, like nothing she'd ever imagined. It was physical pain given voice, agony made audible, and it came not from the organs themselves but from everywhere, from the forest, from the earth, from the sky. The organs writhed in the flame, blackening, splitting, releasing fluids that burned with colors Sarah had no names for. And then she heard the wing beats massive and close, and she knew she was out of time. The Stakini dropped from the canopy like a falling nightmare. It was fully transformed now, an owl the size of a grizzly bear, with eyes that burned with malevolent intelligence and talons that gleamed like obsidian knives. But its face was still human, still wearing the features of Tyler and Thomas, superimposed over each other in a grotesque collage. "What have you done?" it shrieked. And the voice was both Tyler and Thomas, and something infinitely older, something that predated language itself. Sarah stood her ground, holding the burning organs, watching them dissolve into ash. "Ended you," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. The Stakini lunged, talons extended, and Sarah braced for impact, but it never came. Midway through its strike, the creature began to fall apart. Its feathers dissolved into smoke. Its flesh sloughed away like wax in flame. The human faces it wore, Tyler's and Thomas's, screamed in unison, and then those two were gone, revealing something underneath that Sarah's mind refused to fully process, something that was neither owl nor human, but somehow fundamentally neither living nor dead. And then it was just gone. Smoke and ash and a smell like burned copper, and Sarah was alone in a forest that had suddenly gone quiet. She stood there for a long moment, the burning remains of the organ still in her hands, and then carefully, methodically, buried them deep in the earth. She scattered the disturbed artifacts back into their burial boxes. She closed the lids, and then, because she didn't know what else to do, she apologized to the ancestors whose rest had been disturbed, to the spirits whose boundaries had been violated, to Thomas who had given his life for strangers, to Tyler who had died because he didn't understand that some things were sacred, not because of tradition but because of terrible necessity. She found Marcus and Jennifer 3 hours later. Marcus was dead, his throat torn out, but he died defending Jennifer, positioning his body between her and the creature. Jennifer was alive, unconscious but breathing, her ankles splinted with branches and strips of cloth that suggested Marcus had taken the time to care for her even while being hunted. The SAR team that finally reached them at dawn didn't believe Sarah's story. She didn't expect them to. The official report called it a tragic accident. Tyler had fallen from a cliff while photographing the canopy, breaking his neck instantly. Marcus had died of injuries sustained while trying to rescue him. Thomas had suffered a heart attack from the exertion. Jennifer's ankle had been broken in a fall during the search. Sarah didn't argue. What was the point? She couldn't prove what she'd seen. The organs were ash. The Stakini was gone. And some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, because speaking them might make them come back. But she never went into Olympic National Park again. And when other young photographers asked her advice about capturing the perfect shot in the wilderness, she gave them a single piece of guidance that they probably thought was quaint, but that she meant with every fiber of her being. Respect the spaces you enter. Honor the boundaries that exist. Some things are sacred, not because we believe in them, but because they keep us safe from what waits beyond belief. She retired from field biology 6 months later, took a position teaching at a university far from any forests, any sacred sites, any places where the old agreements still held. And late at night, when she couldn't sleep, she would remember Tyler's face on that thing, Thomas's voice woven into its speech, and she would remind herself that the natural world she thought she understood was just the surface of something infinitely deeper, infinitely stranger, and infinitely more dangerous than any textbook had ever suggested. The world wasn't ordered and rational and safe. It was wild and old and full of hungers that predated humanity by eons, and the only thing that had kept humanity safe was respect. Respect for boundaries, respect for traditions, respect for warnings passed down through generations. Tyler had learned that lesson too late. Sarah had learned it just in time. And somewhere, in forests all over the world, ancient things waited in the dark, bound by agreements they hadn't forgotten even if humanity had, waiting for someone to break the boundaries again, waiting to hunt, waiting to feed, waiting to wear new faces. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most?